How did ancient Egyptians go to the bathroom? Grosser than Rome. When archaeologists excavating the nobles' quarter at Amarna in the 1920s cleared out the ruins of a wealthy official's house, they found something unexpected tucked into a side room attached to his bedroom. A low limestone seat with a narrow, keyhole-shaped slot cut through its center, mounted over a shallow pit lined with sand. It was, unmistakably, a toilet. One of the earliest sit-down lavatories ever recovered from the ancient world. Built roughly 3,300 years before modern plumbing existed. Excavators found similar seats scattered across the wealthier houses of the city, some carved from limestone. Others, simple wooden frames set over the same kind of sand-filled pit. Part of a broader wave of excavation at Amarna that bombed across multiple seasons of digging by the Egypt Exploration Society, eventually recovered several dozen such installations concentrated almost entirely in the homes of officials, priests, and other members of the city's elite. What they did not find, in house after house belonging to Amarna's ordinary residents, was anything resembling a toilet at all. For decades, that absence read as a simple story about wealth and poverty. Recent research complicates it. When modern parasitologists compared what is known about ancient Egyptian sanitation against the sewers, public latrines, and grand bathhouses of Rome, a civilization famous for engineering its way to cleanliness, the results were not what public health logic would predict. Rome's fancier system may not have made its people any healthier than Egypt's simpler one. In some documented ways, it may have made them sicker. That claim sounds almost absurd on its face, given how thoroughly Roman engineering has shaped the modern image of ancient sanitation. The evidence behind it, drawn from parasite eggs, mummified tissue, and excavated latrine sediment rather than assumption, holds up regardless. The Egyptian theory of disease. To understand why Egyptian medicine cared so much about the bowels in the first place, it helps to start with what Egyptian physicians actually believed made people sick. Egyptian medical texts describe a substance called wekedu, a kind of internal poison believed to originate in the intestines and spread through the body along a network of vessels called mitu, the same channels thought to carry blood, mucus, semen, and tears. If food lingered too long in the gut, Egyptian doctors reasoned, it began to rot, and that rot generated wekedu, which then traveled outward to cause fever, pain, and eventually death. The Ebers Papyrus, a medical text compiled around 1550 BCE from older sources, records this theory in enough detail that modern historians consider it ancient Egypt's closest approximation of a unified disease theory. Centuries before Hippocratic medicine developed its own version of internal corruption in ancient Greece. Some historians of medicine have argued the two theories are not entirely unrelated, pointing to Egypt's long-documented trade and diplomatic contact with the Aegean world as a plausible channel through which the underlying idea that the body's internal balance could spoil and sicken a person from within might have traveled centuries before Hippocrates gave it a Greek vocabulary of humors rather than Egyptian vessels. The practical consequence of that belief was enormous. If disease began in the bowels, then keeping the bowels empty and clean was not a minor hygienic preference. It was preventive medicine in the most literal sense the Egyptians knew. Nearly a quarter of all the prescriptions recorded in the Ebers Papyrus address some form of gastrointestinal complaint, a proportion far higher than any other category of ailment in the text. Regular purging, deliberately inducing vomiting or diarrhea to flush wekedu out of the system before it could spread, became something closer to routine maintenance than emergency treatment. And an entire branch of Egyptian medicine grew up around administering it properly. The mitu network described in the Ebers Papyrus extended the theory well beyond simple digestion. Egyptian physicians described 46 separate vessels branching from the heart, which they considered the body's central organ of thought as well as circulation, carrying not just blood but air, tears, urine, and semen to every part of the body in a single interconnected plumbing system. Wekedu, once generated in the gut, could theoretically travel along any of these channels to lodge almost anywhere, which is part of why Egyptian prescriptions treat such an enormous range of complaints, headaches, joint pain, skin conditions, as ultimately digestive in origin. A blocked or corrupted vessel near the head might explain a headache, exactly the same way a blocked vessel near a joint might explain arthritis. And in both cases, the recommended remedy frequently circled back to the same starting point: clear the gut, and the rest of the system should, in theory, correct itself. The specialists. That branch of medicine produced one of the more startling job titles to survive from the ancient world. Egyptian physicians who specialized in administering enemas held the formal title Neru Pehut, usually translated as shepherd of the anus, sometimes rendered herdsman of the anus depending on the papyrus. One of the earliest known holders of the title, a physician named Iranakti, who served around 2150 BCE, held it as a genuine royal appointment, responsible for keeping the pharaoh's digestive system functioning and, by extension, granted the kind of close physical access to the king that few other officials ever received. The Ebers Papyrus lists specific purgative ingredients these specialists worked with, including colocynth, a bitter desert gourd with powerful laxative properties, and castor oil, both administered in carefully measured doses meant to induce controlled purging rather than simple, unregulated illness. The role carried real prestige rather than embarrassment. Administering an enema to a pharaoh using a bronze or gold cannula was a position of trust roughly comparable to England's much later groom of the stool, a royal attendant whose intimate duties came bundled with genuine political influence simply because of the proximity to the monarch it required. Iranakti was not an isolated case. Surviving titles and tomb inscriptions from across the Old and Middle Kingdoms record multiple individuals holding variations of the same enema specialist role, suggesting a recognized, ongoing medical specialty rather than a single eccentric appointment invented for one unusually constipated king. Some of these physicians combine the role with broader medical duties, treating wounds and prescribing general remedies alongside their specialized digestive work, while others appear in the record focused narrowly enough on the bowel that modern historians of medicine consider them among the earliest documented specialists in any single organ system anywhere in the ancient world. Herodotus, visiting Egypt in the 5th century BCE, recorded a version of the same preoccupation practiced well beyond the palace. According to his account, many Egyptians purged themselves for 3 consecutive days out of every month, using emetics and drenches, believing that all human disease originated from the food a person ate. Whether or not the theory held up, Herodotus was struck enough by the apparent results to make a claim modern readers might find surprising: that the Egyptians, in his estimation, were the healthiest people in the known world, after only the Libyans. A distinction he attributed partly to Egypt's unusually stable climate and partly, implicitly, to exactly this kind of disciplined bodily maintenance. Where the rich went. The physical toilets recovered from sites like Amarna show what that preoccupation with bodily cleanliness looked like in practice for households that could afford it. A wealthy homeowner's lavatory typically consisted of a seat, carved from limestone or built as a simple wooden frame, positioned directly over a shallow pit dug into the floor. In many installations, that pit contained a removable pottery vessel, sometimes packed with sand, designed to catch waste and be carried out and emptied rather than left to accumulate in place. The seats themselves were cut with a narrow keyhole-shaped opening rather than a simple round hole. A design choice that appears consistently enough across surviving examples, including comparable installations recovered from elite tombs and settlement sites well beyond Amarna, to suggest a standardized, deliberately engineered form rather than ad hoc carpentry unique to one city. These installations were typically located in a small room directly adjoining the master bedroom, a placement that put private sanitation within the same restricted zone of the house as sleeping quarters, physically separated from the kitchen, workshops, and spaces where servants and visitors moved freely. No surviving text specifies exactly who was responsible for carrying the waste-filled vessel out of a nobleman's house once it needed emptying, whether that task fell to a dedicated household servant, a rotating chore among general domestic staff, or some other arrangement entirely. The silence is itself informative. Egyptian household records are otherwise remarkably detailed about domestic labor, wages, and staff assignments, which makes the complete absence of any reference to sanitation labor specifically look less like an accident of preservation and more like a task nobody with the authority to leave written records considered worth documenting. The privacy built into these arrangements reflected a broader pattern in elite Egyptian house design. Wealthier Amarna homes were laid out with a clear gradient of access. Public reception rooms near the entrance where visitors and servants moved freely, giving way progressively to more restricted family spaces, with the bedroom and its attached latrine forming the innermost, most controlled zone of the entire structure. Wooden furniture models recovered from several tombs, built as miniature versions of household items intended to serve their owner in the afterlife, include small stools and seats interpreted by some Egyptologists as toilet furniture, suggesting the concept mattered enough to Egyptian domestic life that people wanted a version of it available even after death, where everyone else went. For the vast majority of Egyptians who were not wealthy officials, the archaeological record goes conspicuously quiet. At Kahun, the best documented planned town from the Middle Kingdom, built to house priests, administrators, and laborers maintaining the pyramid cult of Senusret II. Excavators recovered an extraordinary volume of daily material, tools, papyri covering medical and legal matters, domestic pottery, and yet no confirmed toilet installations at all. That gap does not necessarily mean the town's residents had no sanitary arrangements whatsoever. It more likely means whatever those arrangements were, they left no durable trace for archaeology to recover. A portable ceramic vessel used, emptied, and reused does not survive in the ground the way a carved limestone seat does. The likeliest reality for most Egyptians outside the wealthiest households involved some combination of a simple pot kept for the purpose indoors, overnight or in bad weather, and the fields, riverbank, or open desert edge the rest of the time. The same basic arrangement that remained standard for most of the rural world for thousands of years afterward, well past the point Rome would build its famous sewers, and one that persisted in many parts of rural Egypt itself into the 20th century, largely unchanged by 3 intervening millennia of foreign conquest and imported technology. At its pharaonic peak, Egypt's population is generally estimated in the low millions. The overwhelming majority of them farmers and laborers living in exactly this kind of archaeologically invisible housing, which means the limestone toilets recovered from places like Amarna represent, at most, a small, privileged fraction of how Egyptians actually managed this part of daily life. Given how central the Wakedu theory was to Egyptian medical thinking across every social class, it is reasonable to assume ordinary Egyptians cared just as much about regular, disciplined bowel habits as their wealthier neighbors. They simply lacked the household infrastructure and the archaeological visibility to leave modern excavators anything to find. This disparity did not disappear as Egypt passed through later periods of foreign rule. Ptolemaic and Roman-era settlements in Egypt show the same broad pattern. Private sanitary installations concentrated in wealthier homes and largely absent from the archaeological record of poorer districts. Even as Roman administrators introduced their own engineering traditions elsewhere in the empire. Egypt, in other words, never fully adopted the public latrine model Rome built in its own Italian and provincial cities, which makes the later comparison between the two systems less a story of one civilization replacing another's approach, and more a story of two very different sanitation cultures existing side by side under the same imperial administration for centuries without ever fully merging. Cleaning up afterward. What Egyptians used to clean themselves afterward is one of the more debated details in the entire subject. Papyrus is frequently cited in popular accounts as ancient Egypt's version of toilet paper, and the material's absorbency would have made it functionally plausible. But papyrus was also a genuinely expensive, labor-intensive product, manufactured through a multi-step process of slicing, pressing, and drying reed pith, and used primarily for writing. A use valuable enough that surviving papyri were often recycled, scraped clean, and reused rather than discarded. No administrative or medical text describes papyrus being manufactured or purchased specifically for sanitary use, which makes routine toilet use, for anyone below the wealthiest tier of society, unlikely as an everyday practice rather than an occasional luxury. The more probable everyday tools were considerably cruder. Smooth flat stones, kept and reused, or broken shards of pottery. The same ostraca Egyptians used elsewhere for everything from tax receipts to student writing exercises when full papyrus was too costly to spare. Natron, the naturally occurring salt compound Egyptians mined from dry lake beds and used extensively in mummification, also served a parallel role in ordinary hygiene, employed for washing hands, laundering linen, and even freshening breath, a substance versatile enough to bridge the sacred, the medical, and the merely practical within a single culture's understanding of cleanliness. Water jars positioned near household entrances, recovered at multiple settlement sites, suggest hand washing before meals was routine enough to warrant a dedicated, easily accessible vessel, rather than an occasional formality reserved for special occasions. Ritual purity requirements layered an additional standard of cleanliness on top of ordinary domestic hygiene. At least for one specific class of Egyptian, the priesthood. Herodotus records that Egyptian priests bathed in cold water twice during the day and twice again at night, shaved their entire bodies, including their eyebrows, every other day, and wore only linen, a fabric they considered cleaner than wool because it could be washed more thoroughly and did not come from an animal. Whether ordinary Egyptians outside the temple staff maintained anything close to that standard is unrecorded. But the fact that Egyptian religious culture built such an elaborate, specific purity regimen around bathing and shaving at all suggests cleanliness carried genuine moral and spiritual weight in Egyptian thought, not simply a practical afterthought to daily life. What the bodies actually show, whatever the exact combination of belief, ritual purging, and improvised toilet arrangements Egyptians relied on, the physical evidence preserved in their own mummified remains tells a harder story than any papyrus prescription. A broad meta-analysis of Egyptian mummies tested for parasitic infection found roughly 65% positive for schistosomiasis, a disease caused by parasitic flatworms that thrive in fresh water and infect people who wade, bathe, or work in contaminated irrigation canals. Precisely the kind of water contact Nile agriculture required from a large share of the population. Paleopathological evidence confirms schistosomiasis was present in Egypt continuously for at least 5,000 years, and several surviving medical papyri describe symptoms, including blood in the urine, that modern physicians now recognize as classic signs of the disease, even though Egyptian doctors had no framework for understanding a parasitic cause. The same broad survey found lice on roughly 40% of mummies examined, and signs of visceral leishmaniasis, a parasitic disease spread by sandfly bites, in about 10%, a combined picture of chronic, overlapping infection that would have been the ordinary condition of life for a significant share of the ancient Egyptian population, rather than an occasional misfortune. Other parasites left their own trace. Fish tapeworm eggs, preserved in the pelvic remains of a naturally mummified burial from Nubia dated to between 700 and 300 BCE, point directly to a diet that included undercooked river fish. Roughly 22% of mummies tested in the broader survey showed evidence of Falciparum malaria, the same parasite later identified in Tutankhamun's own tissue, spread by mosquitoes that bred in the same irrigation infrastructure that made Egyptian agriculture possible in the first place. Some researchers examining regional variation in these infection rates have suggested Upper Egypt, with its narrower floodplain and more concentrated irrigation networks, may have carried an even heavier parasite burden than the broader Nile Delta, though the sample sizes involved remain small enough that this regional pattern is treated as a working hypothesis rather than settled fact. None of this proves Egyptian sanitary practices were uniquely bad. It demonstrates something narrower and, for a civilization this preoccupied with bowel health, genuinely ironic. The very river that made Egyptian civilization possible, and the irrigation canals that extended its reach across the floodplain, exposed nearly every farmer, fisherman, and laundry worker in the country to a rotating cast of parasites no amount of purging or enema therapy could ever have reached. Geography shaped exposure unevenly across the country. Farmers and fishermen working directly in or near irrigation canals, and the Nile itself, faced far higher schistosomiasis risk than scribes, priests, or craftsmen whose work kept them largely on dry land. Which means the burden of parasitic disease in ancient Egypt tracked occupation and social class almost as closely as it tracked geography. Layering onto the same wealth divide already visible in who did and did not have a private limestone toilet at home. Grosser than Rome. That evidence sets up a genuinely useful comparison, because Rome, unlike Egypt, is remembered specifically for solving this problem through engineering. Roman cities built extensive sewer networks, public latrines seating dozens of people at once, and elaborate public bathhouses, all commonly cited as proof of superior classical sanitation. The lived reality inside those famous public latrines was considerably less refined than the architecture suggests. Roman public toilets offered no stalls and no real privacy, just continuous stone benches with keyhole openings cut side by side, seating dozens of users simultaneously in cities like Ostia and Tika, where surviving latrine buildings still show the full row of openings intact. Roman togas provided some incidental modesty, but nothing resembling the private, single-user arrangement even a modest Egyptian household with a curtained side room could offer. Cleaning afterward typically meant reaching for a tersorium, a natural sea sponge mounted on a stick, rinsed in a channel of running water or a bucket of water and vinegar, between uses and then left for the next person. The same sponge, used by dozens of different people across a single day, functioned as an efficient way to pass along whatever parasites or pathogens the previous user happened to be carrying. Even Rome's most celebrated piece of sanitary infrastructure carried less practical benefit than its reputation suggests. The Cloaca Maxima. Rome's great central sewer functioned for much of its early history primarily as stormwater drainage for the low-lying forum rather than a comprehensive household waste system. And many ordinary Roman residents living in multi-story apartment blocks had no direct connection to it at all. relying instead on chamber pots that were, by multiple surviving Roman accounts, sometimes simply emptied out of upper floor windows into the street below. In 2016, Cambridge archaeologist Piers Mitchell published a systematic review of parasite evidence recovered from Roman-era latrines, cesspits, and human remains across the empire, comparing infection rates against the preceding Iron Age. The results ran directly against what Roman engineering would predict. Rates of whipworm, roundworm, and the dysentery-causing parasite, Entamoeba histolytica, did not fall under Roman rule. They rose. Mitchell's review pointed to several likely culprits working together. The Roman practice of spreading human waste directly onto agricultural fields as fertilizer, often without composting it long enough to kill parasite eggs first. A practice Roman agricultural writers like Columella actually recommended as efficient, unaware that the same efficiency was recirculating parasites back into the food supply with every harvest. And the warm, communal bathwater of Roman baths, which was changed too infrequently to prevent parasites from lingering and spreading between bathers who used the same water day after day. Mitchell's own summary of the findings was blunt. Roman sanitation and Roman sanitation law, for all their engineering sophistication, delivered no clear measurable improvement in public health. Though the Romans, he noted dryly, probably did smell better than the Egyptians for it. Set against that record, Egypt's simpler, more individualized arrangement, a private seat and pit for households that could afford one, unglamorous stones and open ground for those who could not, starts to look less like the primitive alternative and more like an entirely different, and in some specific respects, less actively self-defeating, approach to the same unsolved problem. Legacy schistosomiasis, the parasite responsible for roughly 2/3 of the infections found in ancient Egyptian mummies, never actually left the Nile Valley. The World Health Organization still lists Egypt among the countries where the disease requires active, ongoing public health monitoring, more than 5,000 years after the earliest confirmed cases in mummified remains. A continuity that makes ancient Egyptian medicine's fixation on the bowels feel less like superstition and more like a culture correctly sensing a real danger it had no biological framework to actually explain. The Wakadu theory was wrong about the specific mechanism. There was no self-generated internal poison seeping from the intestines through a network of vessels. But the underlying instinct that whatever happened in the gut mattered enormously to overall health was not so far from where modern gastroenterology eventually arrived by an entirely different, evidence-based route. Deir el-Medina's workers' village kept unusually detailed daily attendance records for its royal tomb-building crews. And among the recorded reasons for missed workdays, alongside scorpion stings and unspecified eye trouble, digestive complaints appear often enough that modern researchers reading the ledgers can trace something close to a running sick log for a single ancient workforce. 3,000 years before the concept of an occupational health record existed anywhere else. The limestone seat recovered from that nobleman's house at Amarna still sits in a museum collection today. One of the most tangible surviving links between a modern visitor and the daily, unglamorous rhythms of an ancient Egyptian household. It survived for over 3,000 years for the same reason most ancient toilets do. Stone outlasts flesh, wood, and empire alike. Rome's sewers survived too, and for centuries stood as the more celebrated monument to ancient sanitation. The parasite eggs recovered from both civilizations' remains suggest that reputation was never entirely earned, and that the real difference between an Egyptian farmer relieving himself at the river's edge and a Roman citizen using a shared sponge in a marble-lined public latrine may have been smaller, and considerably less flattering to Rome than either civilization would have guessed. Public health agencies working along the Nile today still run schistosomiasis prevention campaigns, targeting the exact same irrigation canals that infected Egyptian farmers 5,000 years ago. Using modern drugs and water treatment methods, a shepherd of the Amos could never have imagined, but aimed at a parasite that outlasted the pharaohs, the Ptolemies, the Romans, and every sanitation system any of them ever built. The keyhole-shaped seat, the shared sponge on a stick, the quiet daily walk to the riverbank. 3 different solutions to the same unavoidable problem. None of them fully adequate. All of them still leaving their trace in the bodies of the people who use them.